But a couple of other points which I think we need to reflect on. The point was made yesterday that one shouldn't get hung up on concepts. But we've also discussed, and it came up in the last panel, that ultimately there has got to be wider public engagement and participation, and perhaps even approval of whatever is agreed upon and whatever has to be implemented. And the point was made about communication strategy, persuading people, responding to the genuine concerns and fears of certain groups at what is unfamiliar constitutional territory, federalism, autonomy. And in that light, I do think that it is important to have a certain amount of conceptual clarity with respect to some of the concepts that we have discussed in the last few days. And to me, there is a difference between the concept of federalism and the concept of autonomy. They are similar, but I think they are also different. And in some of my work in my own country, Sri Lanka, and also in Nepal, I have experienced the fact that if one talks about sometimes the distinction between federalism and autonomy, the public tend to accept the concept of federalism without so much fear and without so much apprehension. And to me, the key difference is that both federalism and autonomy talk about self-rule, but federalism also emphasizes the notion of shared rule. And in Asia, I think one of the concerns that many groups and people have about the concept of federalism, more than in other parts of the world, is that federalism is seen as a stepping stone to secession. So in Scotland, in Canada, and in Spain, you could even have referenda on the issue of secession, but this would be unthinkable in Sri Lanka, Nepal, Myanmar, and possibly in other countries in the region. And so we've got to recognize this difference, this reality, and therefore, because of this reality of the fear of secession, this fear, or this obsession, if you like, about territorial integrity, I think stressing the fact that federalism is equally about shared rule is very important. And so, as Sujit Chowdhury and George Anderson stressed this morning, shared rule means that we should not only focus on self-rule, but also on inclusive and representative national institutions, finance and devolution commissions that are not central, but truly national, human rights commissions, RTI commissions, police commissions, which have representation from the regions and therefore are truly national. The point was also made and stressed about the need for a second chamber. I have a slightly different view to George Anderson on that. I do not think that a second chamber design necessarily is impacted too much by the fact of by the issue of whether we have a presidential or parliamentary form of government. I think one can be creative about the design of a second chamber to ensure that its primary rationale in a federal context is to give the regions or the provinces a voice at the center. And I think in that respect, the South African Council of Provinces is something that addresses some of George Anderson's concerns about party politics dominating, and where the second chamber can really then be a watchdog to protect devolution and also an institution that gives the provinces a stake at the center. My second point is about, again, because of the Asian reality of diversity. I mean, Philippines has more than, we learned yesterday, 130 odd ethnic groups. Nepal has more than 100. And so because of that reality of diversity, I think if you're talking about federalism or autonomy in this part of the world, the minorities within a minority critique of federalism is something that federalists and people in favor of autonomy have got to take very seriously. That is where there is a concern that a federal arrangement will favor the large groups in the regions or in the provinces and result in the smaller groups within those provinces or regions being discriminated against or ultimately suffering. And that is why those smaller groups often turn out to be spoilers and opponents of federalism. So the basics must be remembered. The whole purpose of constitutionalism is to be a counter-majoritarian device. That's the basic 101 principle. But that should apply even at the regional or provincial levels in a federal arrangement. And so we tend, when we're talking about federalism, to focus on the group, to focus on ethnicity, and this is natural and inevitable. But let's not forget the importance of protecting the minority, within a minority, individuals, and individuals' equality and dignity. And that is why I think a national Bill of Rights, which binds all organs of government, both at the center and at the provinces, becomes very important. And that is why also we need to challenge sometimes the champions of federalism who want to stop federalism at the regional or provincial level and stop the federal idea from percolating down to the local and the smaller units. So in Nepal and in Sri Lanka, it's very significant that the champions of federalism or devolution to the provinces are also staunchly opposed to strengthening local government because they are fearful of the first tier of government making use of the third tier to undermine the second. And so we've got to address that concern, address that fear, but also think of constitutional and political mechanisms to ensure that that doesn't happen, so that the federal idea actually does percolate down to the smaller groups as well. And that brings me to my third point, that federalism really and autonomy cannot be considered or discussed in isolation. They are inextricably linked with the other constitutional issues and principles, and this too was highlighted by a number of the international experts here yesterday and today. So the rule of law was mentioned. But what about an independent and inclusive constitutional court which can deal with these disputes? It's very interesting that a question was asked yesterday from our Spanish colleague. What happens if there's a dispute between the regions and the constitutional court? And that will invariably happen if the constitutional court is not seen as having empathy with the regions and the minorities, and is seen then as somehow an alien institution that does not have the interests of the regions and the minorities at heart. The powers of the executive. In Sri Lanka, we have such a powerful executive president that he or she is able to undermine the powers of the devolved units. Electoral system design, and as we discussed earlier, second chamber design. And this, again, I would stress, is even more important in the context of Asia because these constitutional arrangements have to deal with a political culture that is centralized, hierarchical, and believes in patronage politics. So, my last point. The point was made about not looking at some of these constitutional questions legalistically or technically. And I think that that's an important point. Federalism, in a sense, encaptures a kind of broader political vision. If you look at its definition and its origin, it is contrasted with the concept of unitary. So the concept of federalism is necessarily pluralistic. It is inclusive. It recognizes diversity and recognizes difference. So it recognizes, affirms, and indeed even celebrates this plurality and this diversity. And I think this is an important point as we think about designing autonomy arrangements, or implementing them, or fine-tuning them in the future. The image which I think captures this very well is Mandela's Rainbow Nation idea, where we celebrate the distinctiveness of the particular, but at the same time within a united whole. And I think that advocates of federalism need to be reminded of this link with pluralism and respect for diversity and difference. In Sri Lanka, in 2003, at the height of the negotiations between the government of Sri Lanka and the Tamil Tigers were given an opportunity to come up with their constitutional proposals for the first time. And the Tamil Tigers that had spent their whole campaign was against the centralized, unitary, majoritarian state of Sri Lanka. But when they came up with their own proposals, they were centralized, they were unitary, and they were majoritarian with respect to their own province. So there needs to be consistency, and we need to be reminded of what the whole federal idea is all about. On my last point, I was struck by this point, particularly in the last session, that at some point, I think those of us who are working in our respective countries to promote federalism and autonomy need to be reminded that perhaps another value of federalism is partnership. And it's perfectly natural for groups to constantly assert their own rights, their own claims. This is justified and natural. But at a certain point in the negotiations or in the partnership towards realization and implementation, I think we've got to transcend being only concerned about one's own and think in terms of transcending it beyond one's group in order to try and ensure that one accommodates the other so that there is meaningful partnership to move forward. And I think I'm speaking on behalf of all the internationals here who are privileged to participate in this workshop, that we were struck by the complexity of the challenges involved and the difficult tasks ahead, which we talked about a little bit in the last session. So we need that cooperation and partnership, I would think, as we move forward. We failed in our federalism project in Sri Lanka. We were only partially successful in Nepal, and I hope that in the Philippines you will meet with much greater success.